If you enjoyed the channel and our video content and would like to support us, you can do this in a couple of ways. You can sign up to our Patreon site, which is a monthly subscription to one of our 4 tiers, each giving you something different from early access interviews up to exclusive unseen footage. There's also the option of a one-off donation via PayPal, which allows you the option to donate an amount of your choice. Both options really help to keep this channel going and to continue putting out regular content for you good folk. So please take a look at aircrewinterview.tv/donate, and I thank you in advance. Thank you and enjoy. So Ward, when did you become interested in aviation?
Kind of at birth, Mike. My dad was a Marine Corps attack pilot, so I was surrounded by airplanes and aviators, and we lived on base when I was little at Marine Corps Air Station El Toro that isn't there anymore. That's where I saw my first air show. That's where I saw the Blue Angels for the first time. Nice. How old is Mooch? They were flying F-11s the first time I saw them, in the early 60s. And so naturally, as I followed my dad's career and followed him around the country and the world. We lived in Holland for 3 years when I was in middle school, when he was the assistant naval attaché in The Hague in the Netherlands, which really did sort of open my worldview quite a bit, and my musical taste, by the way. So that's my first influence. And so when you go through high school, I lived on base at Marine Corps Air Station Cherry Point in North Carolina when I was in high school. My dad was the commanding officer of an A6E squadron, VMA All-Weather 121, the Green Knights.
Nice.
So I got to hang out at the squadron and talk to his junior officers, many of whom were Naval Academy graduates. And as I was getting ready to pick a college, it came down to two. One was the University of Michigan, and the other was the Naval Academy. And you know how it is when you're 17, 18 years old. You have sort of a sense, you don't have any like burning path. And for some reason, the Naval Academy just felt like a better fit. And right. That's a subjective thing, because I had never been to the Naval Academy, which is a huge leap of faith in hindsight. So my SAT scores and my other sort of high school profile was okay, but not good enough to get me in first time. So I wound up getting in a prep school program where I went down to Texas and spent a year in Texas at a prep school, and then entered the Naval Academy during the summer of 1978. And I'm glad I did that in hindsight. At the time, as you graduate, you're graduating from high school and all your friends are going to, UNC and ECU and Duke, and they're like, where are you going? I'm like, I'm going back to high school in Texas. It didn't seem like a good deal, but ultimately it was. And I don't think I was ready to enter the Naval Academy right out of high school. So it worked out. And by the time I got there, I had cut the apron strings, was ready to go. 4 years at the Naval Academy as a midshipman. I loved my life as a midshipman. I sort of identified with every part of it. That doesn't mean everything was awesome. Developing socially was a challenge in that construct. And, I had sort of that FOMO, fear of missing out, from time to time. Grades were always a challenge. It's a hard school. I was a political science major, but still you have to take a bunch of engineering courses. Thank you, Hyman Rickover. And then you get to be a senior, and it's time to pick the job you're going to have once you get commissioned. So I was relatively open-minded about my options. So, surface warfare, nuke was not an option because I wasn't smart enough, and they didn't, I didn't fit their profile. Not terribly sad about that. Marine Corps, I'd been exposed to the Marine Corps. My eyes were bad, so I knew I couldn't be a pilot. And the Marine Corps naval flight officer guarantees were limited, and they went away very quickly. So that wasn't something I was that was in the cards. One of the senior Marines there was like, well, just go to the basic school, which is where Marines go before they go other places, and do really well. And then you can pick, NFO. I'm like, I that's too risky. I just see myself being a grunt, being an infantry officer. And that's not really what I wanted to do. Again, I have max respect for infantry officers, but that wasn't me. And so of my options, and I'd actually had the opportunity, I see the F-4 behind you there, to fly in the backseat of an F-4J in Hawaii during my what we call first class cruise. I was at Kaneohe Marine Corps Air Station, flew with VMFA 235, the Death Angels, and loved it. I was home, right? It just sort of hits you like a religious experience. Strapping into the Martin Baker, breathing the O2, burners on the takeoff. We did a 1v1. He's asking me to call the fight. I was very aero adaptable, didn't get airsick, loved the feeling of G and just the whole thing. Came back in, actually took an arrested landing at the field because the field at Kaneohe is sort of short. And then we go to the O Club and we're talking with our hands and drinking beer. And I'm like, okay, these are my people. And that's your responsibility, either in ROTC or whatever your accession source is, or at a service academy, is to find your people. So selected what we call NFO, Naval Flight Officer. Went down to Pensacola as soon as I could, wound up doing well in the NFO training. So I got my choice, which was the RIO pipeline, Radar Intercept Officer. At that time, they were still sending people to F-4s as well as F-14s. Obviously, you want the coolest, latest thing. So I was lucky to get F-14s when I got my wings. And then it was just a matter of coast, East Coast, West Coast. This was the glory days of the Tomcat. There were 22 F-14 squadrons at this time, 11 on each coast, and a RAG, the training squadron, on each coast. So I was more of an East Coast kind of guy. I like Virginia Beach. Wound up going to NAS Oceana in Virginia Beach. Because I did well in the RAG, I was top scope, something I'm very proud of, among my peers. And my RAG class were all Naval Academy classmates. The RIOs were all Naval Academy classmates, something I've documented on the channel a few times, who all went on to great things in the airplane. Not all of them are with us anymore, but I was very proud to be number one among those guys. But as a function of that, I was the number one draft pick to go to a fleet squadron. So I went to VF-32, the Swordsman, which has a very rich heritage. If you've seen the movie Devotion, Jesse Brown and Thomas Hudner were in the Swordsman flying F-4Us in Korea. So we're flying F-14As, and we're going right on cruise. So I was picked to go to VF-32. I went on deployment, do not pass go. And that's a cool way to do it, really, because until you've had a deployment, you're a new guy. And so a lot of guys join their squadron and they just have to go through this new guy thing for like 6 months or maybe a year before they go on cruise. Like, because everybody's going to like lecture you and mansplain you about, on deployment, ... So for me, I went right on deployment, didn't have to weather all of that. Port calls in places like Palma, and we went all the way to Singapore, and we're in the Med, and we're in the North Arabian Sea. These are the days before you went to into the Persian Gulf, flying intercepted Russian An-22s and Iranian P-3s, and we did an exercise called Beacon Flash against the Omanis, and their Star Wars Canyon there is amazing, and 1v1s against Jaguars and Hawker hunters, and just great ops, flying a lot, and went through the Suez Canal for the first time. So it was really an amazing, eye-opening experience for me. And the squadron was, like any fighter squadron, full of talented, big personalities, and I just was at home there. That's where I got my call sign. We were in port in Palma, and I was out of money, and I asked a guy if I could borrow some money, and his response was, "You're a mooch." And everybody around the table was like, "Oh, that's it. That's it." And that's what people get them for a lot of different reasons. In fact, I did an episode about sort of the etymology of call signs. So that's how I got mine. So go through that tour, cruised on Independence, and then we cross-decked over to Kennedy, which had just come out of the yards. So my first two deployments were on conventional carriers, something we don't have anymore. And that's pretty sporty habitability, right? I mean, the water tastes like JP5. Sometimes the showers don't work. Often the showers don't work. The AC will shut off for no reason from time to time. So you learn to appreciate creature comforts. but those ships worked great, and I'm proud of my roughing it on conventional carriers in the early days. So finished that tour. Now you go to shore duty, and and also the second deployment on Kennedy, we never left the Med. So this is a Cold War era deployment. So we're doing cat and mouse against the Russians, Krivaks and Sovremenes and Moskva and, all of Kiev class and so forth. That was the name of the game. And pulling into a lot of ports. So it was sort of what we call a love boat deployment, where we pull into port. My fiance, now wife, visited me when we were in Nice, or in Cannes rather. We went over to Nice and had a good time. So it was an old school deployment. It was very much an 80s deployment, a lot of fun. And again, the squadron was enjoyable. The CO kind of became the model for Soup Campbell and Punk's war, but that's a different story. And so shore duty time, I wanted to keep flying among my options because I really didn't do that great among my peers in terms of fitness reports in that during that deployment for a myriad reasons, and which in fact was the sort of impetus behind, or the momentum, the catalyst behind Punk's war. But I wound up being an instructor down at VT-86, which is the RIO training squadron, which was a lot of fun. And so I got to train the next generation of RIOs before they got their wings. In fact, I served with some of these guys later when I went back to the Tomcat community. And then after only a year at VT-86, I was asked to do an unorthodox thing, to go become the editor of Approach magazine, which was the Naval Aviation Safety magazine, right? The Safety Center in Norfolk puts that out. And the reason I got that job is because I had started doing a cartoon for Approach called Brown Shoes in Action Comics, which had sort of an underground, R. Crumb feel to it. It had a little bit of a seditious tone, but there was always this safety message baked in. I was kind of surprised what I got away with under that sort of platform. And the guy's name was Danger Boy. I'd actually been a cartoonist for the magazine, The Lampoon, at the Naval Academy too. And so I only know how to draw like one character, and Danger Boy looks a lot like this guy that was called Morty Mid back at the Naval Academy, and except Danger Boy has a cleft chin. Morty Mid didn't. So that was fun. I did that for years, and I got some notoriety as a function of that. That was my first sort of, media impact, was the guy behind Brown Shoes in Action Comics, because this is way before I was a novelist. So as a function of that notoriety, and also the fact that when I was the editor of Approach, I was flying at Oceana with whoever would have me. So most of that was with VF-43, the aggressor squadron, the Challengers, call sign Ambush, and they had TA-4s, F-5Fs, two-seat F-16s, the F-16N. What a spank.
Oh, the N, yeah, wow.
Yes, so I am getting a lot of stick time, and because pilots used to love to just go, feet off the brakes, okay, Mooch, you got the airplane. So I learned how to fight all of those airplanes, fly parade, all of these things. People are like, why do you fly DCS so well? It's because of that, because you were a RIO. What do you know? I'm like, okay, stick with me, right? And so did that tour, and as a function of that tour and me being involved over at Fighter Wing, I became what's called a by name call to go back to a fighter squadron. So I went back to VF-143, a very unorthodox, sort of put the little trolley back on the rails in a way that was unorthodox. Because generally when you go to the training command, you'll go to be ship's company. You're going to be a shooter or assistant air ops or something. And I was able to not do that and stay in the airplane. Okay, so the Puking Dogs, kick-ass logo. It's the Griffin.
Oh yeah.
Got it right here. The winged dog looks like it's hunched over and puking. That's how the squadron got its nickname. And at this time, they had gotten brand new jet smell, fresh from Grumman.
Ooh,
what we called F-14A pluses at that time, right? 6 months later, redesignated the F-14B. So get rid of the Pratt & Whitney TF-30, known for compressor stalling, just like you saw in Top Gun, the original Top Gun. Now we have the GE F-110. a great engine, right? And the backseat had some other gear. We had new raw gear, new missile warning indication gear, and so forth. So and this squadron was an all-star team. The CO was great at wooing the talent. And so we had just this ready room that made my first squadron look like amateurs. Also, I'm on my first nuke boat. So we're on the Eisenhower. And so I realized that habitability was much better on a nuclear carrier than on a conventional carrier.
Yeah.
And so we haul ass, the war starts, Desert Storm. I'm in the rag. My CO's like saying, my future CO, the dog CO, it's like, you got to get here because we're going to war. So they put me through a quickie, what we call a Cat 2 syllabus at the rag, and I got to the squadron and the war ended, right? And so we went to Fallon, ready to join the effort, and then the war ended while we were out there. So they delayed our deployment. We didn't go till, about 6 months after hostilities ended. Now, when we got there, it was like showing up the morning after a really wild party.
Right.
It's like, wow, this is nuts. This is really, and people are like, oh yeah, we're still hungover, right? And so oil fire is still raging.
Wow.
Ubian Bridge blown out. Highway to Hell was cleared, but the cars were still just pushed to the side of the road.
Wow.
The devastation was substantial. We would fly over Al Jaber. You could see the hangars were the reinforced hangars were all blown out. I think your lads did that in the tornado.
Yeah.
And so it was wild. And also that's the first time I went in the Gulf proper. So transiting through the straits there of Hormuz and felt a little weird. It's like, we're in range of missiles here. And you didn't have a whole lot of time to react between Iraq and Iran. So we got comfortable with that, pulled into Dubai, which was a shadow of its current self back then. There was one hotel, the Hilton, and nothing else. And you look at, it now, it's amazing.
Yeah.
And so that was a great tour. And it really did sort of get my attitude right. Because to be honest, I was thinking about getting out of the Navy after that first tour when I was down at VT-86. In fact, most of the RIO instructors did get out of the Navy. They were all, when they had free time, they're getting their MBAs, and they were all going other places.
Right. Because
I got to go be the editor of Approach, it sort of saved my outlook and my career. So I did a shorty tour in 143, 22 months. And then if you have to fill out a resume, you're already behind the power curve. You want to be asked, and then the resume becomes just an admin sort of after the fact. And so the same with the Navy. And so now I'm developing a reputation as a talented RIO and a good guy to have around, and an officer who does his job well, because it's not just about the airplane, as I discovered after my first tour. And so I go to the RAG to be an instructor, VF 101, the Grim Reapers. And again, this is where it just keeps getting better and better. The RAG, if I thought VF 143 was an all-star team, the RAG is the true all-star team. It's all the best from the entire East Coast squadron base. So, and I was a fresh-caught lieutenant commander. So I had all of these hard-charging lieutenants doing all the work, and I was just bottom-lining stuff. And we're flying all manner of missions. And so we'd go down to Key West to do dogfighting for the tactics syllabus, be down there for 2 weeks. We'd do that in January. And we'd go to El Centro to do the strike mission, because now the Tomcat is dropping bombs. So we have a strike service. It's before Lantern, so we're not doing precision-guided bomb dropping, but we're doing dumb bomb dropping. And so we're starting to introduce that. And carrier quals, which is sporty. The F-14A particularly was a hard airplane to land, as I've documented on the channel. Carroll, Holgreen, and others proved that. May she rest in peace. So taking a nugget to the boat for the first time takes a special set of skills for a RIO. And again, this is where I say I am as much a co-pilot as I am a weapons systems operator in the F-14. I know the front seat as well as a pilot. Because of my time as a RAG instructor. So that was very rewarding. Also, your network is forged because you meet all the guys coming through to do a what we call a Cat 3 or Cat 4 syllabus to go to be an XOC of a squadron. You're their instructor during their time in the RAG. So the Mooch brand was ubiquitous, by the time I finished my tenure as a RAG instructor. However, there was a little detour. I was asked to go be the aide to Air Lant, the air boss. And this is before there was a lead-follow relationship. Now, Air Pac is the air boss. In fact, the current air boss is a guy who was a RAG instructor with me, Kenny Weitzel. So he's a 3-star. Air Lant is a 2-star these days. Back in those days, both of the type commanders were 3-stars. So I worked for a guy named Vice Admiral Tony Less, who was a light attack guy, had been CO of the Blue Angels when they transitioned from F4s to A4s, and had been CO of Ranger. He was Nav Cent before there was a 5th Fleet. In fact, he was there for Praying Mantis operation, where we basically sunk the Iranian Navy. And an incredible guy. So I'd flown with him. I introduced him to bombing in the F-14 when I was a RAG instructor. His aide got in trouble, and so he needed a new aide, and so he picked me. So I was yanked out of the RAG, not quite kicking and screaming, but I wasn't really interested in being on an admiral's staff, and went to be his aide. And so this is another one of those things where, if you just show up with the right attitude, particularly the Navy will take care of you. I mean, I love the Navy for everything it allowed me to do, and this is why I'm very bullish, and I'm very grateful that I get to use the channel to socialize these sorts of things, warts and all. So because Admiral Les was such a fantastic human being, we wound up, I was allowed to do things that most aides don't do. And his staff was super tight. And so when he would get a call from another admiral, there were actually 3 people on the phone: the executive assistant, who was a Navy captain, a P3 guy named Greg Wedding, and me. So we would listen to the conversation. The reason we do that is because when he hung up, he didn't want to have to explain to us what the conversation was about. We would have all the answers as soon as he hung up, but in the course of that, I heard some things that were pretty eye-opening for a, fresh caught lieutenant commander who'd only been in fighter squadrons to that point, and so my blinders came off. The machine made sense to me. And so this served me well when I went back, again, by name call, to join VF 102, the Diamondbacks, aboard America. They were just transitioning. This is where Mooch was very lucky, from the F-14A to the F-14B, aboard an old carrier, the last cruise of America. So now I've done, this is my 4th deployment. 3 of them are on conventional carriers, only 1 on a nuke. And so we took America to what turned out to be the Bosnian conflict. We didn't know that's what we were going to do when we left Norfolk and we flew aboard from Oceana. In fact, we thought it was going to be like my 2nd deployment, sort of a love boat cruise. And we had planned out all of these port calls, and the wives were going to come over, and it was all sort of, this will be kind of a predictable thing. We got to the Azores during the translant, and Admiral Bill Cross, Tomcat guy, came up on the 1MC, the intercom, and said, "Gentlemen, I just got a call from 6th Fleet, and we've been told to make best speed for the Adriatic. We're going to war." That's exactly what he said. Because the Theodore Roosevelt and CAG 8 had started dropping bombs on Sarajevo, try to convince the Serbs to break the siege of that city.
Yeah.
And because as you know, and I'm sure the listeners know, the genocide in the early 90s was horrific. This is sort of the fallout of the breakup of the Soviet Union. And it was something that NATO particularly wanted to do something about. So we got there, and immediately our Hornets started joining the fight, did a quick turnover with the Roosevelt. They left, and we owned the war. So again, this is before the F-14 has Lantern, our precision-guided capability. So what we did is we were basically an extension of the Hornet. And when I say Hornet, that's Legacy Hornet, F-18C, not Super Hornet. So we would dial in the laser codes, or basically the Hornet would dial in the laser codes, and they would tell us to pickle, and they would guide the bomb that we dropped.
Right.
So we were basically an extension of their wing, and we could carry 4 Mark 80 series dumb bombs on the airplane. And so we wound up doing that. The main thing we did, because this is before the digital era as well, so wet film is the state of the art in terms of airborne reconnaissance. There's a pod that fits on the bottom of the Tomcat called TARPS, Tactical Air Reconnaissance Pod System, 3 cameras in it, horizon to horizon, an IR camera, and another one that looks in front. And we would fly all around as tasked by the Joint Forces Command in Vincenza. That tasking came a lot. And it would be pop up like the mass graves of Perigador, go over there and take a picture of it. So we did that a lot. And so I spent a lot of time over Bosnia. In fact, that's how I earned my air medal, which I have here next.
Nice one.
Which is the award I'm most proud of in my career. And that was really intense. So we didn't suffer the fate of Scott O'Grady. We didn't get shot down by SA-6s. We had kind of nullified their tactical SAM capability by that time. And anytime we went feet dry, we had a Prowler and company, the electric. So you couldn't go without a Prowler able to jam pop-up threats. We would see some stuff on the ground. I remember doing one TARPS mission particularly, and we do kind of the 4 corners around the country. Don't spill out into Serbia. That's bad, right? So turning on the northwest quadrant there by Banja Luka, and during the turn, I look down and there's like explosions happening on this ridge line. And you kind of like, oh yeah, there's a war going on down there.
Yeah.
You're in your sort of sterile environment. At that time, we used this big GPS. This is before the airplane had any kind of GPS. The INS was notorious for drifting.
Oh, really?
So you couldn't really rely on that. Oh yeah, the Tomcat INS was designed to get the Phoenix missile into a 25-mile basket. It was not designed to make you not fly into Serbia.
Got you.
So there were different updates we could do based on georefs or whatever, or your waypoint. If you had a waypoint in there and you saw that there was difference, you could do a correction and the waypoint would jump to where you actually were, and that would fix the INS. This is where RIOs made their money. But we also had this new thing we called it the Fisher Price, because it was like the size of a kid's toy with gigantic buttons and had this antenna. It was a GPS unit. The screen was like microscopic, but the device was huge. And so it worked great, and we do updates based on that. However, when you went into a turn, the antenna would get blanked.
Oh.
So you'd be like,
Yeah.
During that, you'd come out of the turn and it would have to look at the satellites again. It would take a while. And so that was kind of nerve-wracking. But this is sort of the transition of an analog airplane into a digital airplane for one thing, and also strict fighter, dumb bomber into precision-guided kick-ass weapon that served the nation well towards the end of its existence. So Bosnia ends. In fact, the French brokered a peace thing. So that hot op turned into a presence piece for the balance of that deployment. We did a quickie jaunt down through the Suez Canal and around the Arabian Gulf into the Persian Gulf. During that time, I got to lead a 2-plane TARPSTET out of Al Jaber, Kuwait. So carrier clears the Suez to the south. We launch off, fly over Saudi, which is really cool, into this base in Kuwait, Al Jaber, which many Desert Storm vets operated out of, Harrier guys and Air Force A-10 folks. Casey Campbell, who's been on the channel, a female A-10 pilot who's awesome, operated out of Al Jaber. So time off the boat is good time. And so I got to lead this 2-plane detachment. We had a maintenance det with us. And so at night, there was this liaison guy who was actually a what we call a fallen angel. He was taken off flight status. He kept his wings, but that was his job, was to shepherd visiting guys into Kuwait City at night so they could do things like go to Fuddruckers, and get a normal hamburger or whatever. And so we did that. It was just really, again, the stuff you did around flying is what made the profession amazing. I remember we're driving this, I think it was a Forerunner, along this highway, and it's flat, and there's like a camel train out there, and the sun is setting. It's looked at as something out of Central Casting, right? And so we get closer, and we're like, roll the window down, because we had what we called the Diamondback Thrill Cam. It was a big VHS camera, and so like roll the window down, and we were pretty close. And as soon as we rolled the window down, you could smell the camels. It's like, oh no, roll the window back up. Those are nasty animals, if you ever were wondering. Yeah. They're mean too. But anyway, so did that for 6 days, I guess, and then flew back aboard, and we were on the night page of Operation Southern Watch, which is the patrolling of the no-fly zone of Iraq below the 33rd parallel. So the Air Force did what they were doing noon to midnight. We did midnight to noon.
Right.
And so that was kind of body clock challenging. Yeah. So imagine you brief a flight at 1 a.m., you launch at 3 a.m., and you get back at 6. So you're coming back at sunrise. So you'd launch case 3, which is the nighttime procedure, and then you'd come back case 1. It's kind of weird, kind of fun. Or you just do case 3 if you were doing all nighttime ops. So my body never got used to, because you're like, oh, just go to sleep, and it's like, I can't go to sleep at 10 a.m. I just and so that was challenging. Turns out we were only there for about 10 days, and then we were ordered back to the Adriatic because the Serbs were threatening to do something stupid again. And so we did that for the rest of that cruise. So that was a fantastic tour.
Amazing.
I was the operations officer for VF 102, and we worked our ass off. We broke all existing records for Tomcat deployment. We won the Battle E, which is the award for excellence. Again, it's just great to be on a team that's super talented like that. And the CO was a great guy and let me do my thing. And that's all I asked, really. And so as a function of that tour, I was asked by the deputy air wing commander, who was about to be the air wing commander, to come be his operations officer in the same air wing. So that meant I'm going to do back-to-back sea duty. So I called from the sailor phone home, that we had now. Now you could call home. They had these little cards, so you'd pay $10 for 10 minutes. Wow. And I called Mrs. Carroll, Mrs. Mooch, and said, you want to take it around the track again? And her father had been an A6 pilot, and she grew up in naval aviation and went to high school in Virginia Beach, and she had a great spouse network, and they knew what they wanted to do. In fact, at some level, they were upset when the husbands came home because they wrecked everything that they would do in terms of parties and get-togethers. Put the kids in the playpen, and we'll go over here and drink wine or whatever. And so she was like, let's do it, because it was going to be good for my career, because I was playing makeup from that first tour in some ways, needed to get well, and was also going to be working for a guy who was awesome, Boomer Sufflebeam. And so I met Admiral Mike Mullen during, we were down in Roosevelt Roads doing a Missile X. He was actually a frocked 1-star. He had just pinned on 1-star and got to love him right away. So he was going to be what we called a battle group commander, now called a strike group commander, aboard the USS George Washington. So we're leaving America. America was being retired. Quite proud of what we did on that ship on her last deployment. She was rode hard, but put away in working condition. In fact, I invite your audience to watch the Kuznetsov episode I did, because I talk about a day we hosted the crew of Kuznetsov aboard America. And that showed just the capability of an American conventional carrier on its last deployment, which was eye-watering to the Russians. So I also got my conning alongside qual, like I was a ship driver on America.
Oh, wow.
A cool thing. Yeah. So I got to do unrep in rough seas, by the way.
Oh,
Bob was the captain. He's a great guy. He's like, a roping and a riding. He's sitting in his chair. We're like, oh. So it was very, very fun and a very tight air wing ship's company team, which, kind of was the rule there was no differentiation really. And that was, leadership always attended to that. So now I did that CAG Ops tour aboard George Washington. Just another side note. So in fact, when I fly DCS, one of the modules in the supercarrier is you're aboard George Washington. So for me, that's like homecoming,
right?
Because it's super realistic. But I also did the shakedown of GW when that carrier was brand new in the early 90s when I was in the dogs. After we got home from Ike deployment back in 92, we were asked to go aboard with a skeleton crew and take GW down to the Puerto Rican operations area, which was a blast. So that was a cherry carrier. We had no admiral staff aboard. We could just fly as much as we wanted. And we pulled into Fort Lauderdale, which is always a good deal. And so I had experience during basically the shakedown of GW. And now I'm cruising on GW for what turned out to be my final deployment. So we go back to the Med, and we're in Haifa, and we get word, actually, Admiral Mullen likes to joke, that he was told by Christian Amanpour on CNN that he was going to the Gulf because he saw the report on TV, and then he was called by the Sixth Fleet Commander, Admiral Havoc, like, hey, Mike, here's a heads up. He said, I already know.
I know.
And so we went to the Gulf, and Rick Hunt was Admiral Mullen's ops officer, later went on to be a 3-star himself.
Wow.
Now works for Fincantieri, the shipbuilder. Great guy. He said to me, we're never coming back to the Met. And that turned out to be true. So we spent the rest of our time, again, doing Operation Southern Watch, flying our asses off. So I got to go into Saudi.
Were you in the B at this time?
Yeah, we're flying Bs. It's the same squadron, same airway. Yeah. So it's CAG 1. So the same squadron I'd been a department head in, aboard America, is now aboard George Washington. So I knew everybody, and it was a rigged game. So I'd just gone through the entire interdeployment training cycle and a deployment. And again, Boomer, Stufflebeam, the CAG, was great at wooing talent. So every member of my staff was an icon in their communities. Helicopter guy, EA6 guy, the intel officers. This is the first time I'd cruised with females, and they were both awesome. I remained good friends with one of them, whose husband was an E2 pilot. And so again, I mean, what's to not like? I have great support on the home front. I'm working for people like Mike Mullen, who went on to be the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, as I'm sure you probably know.
Yeah. We're
aboard a carrier with kick-ass airplanes. Now we also have Lantern. So between my department head tour and being CAG Ops, Snort Snodgrass, who was fighter wing, Larry Slade, who was actually a POW during Desert Storm. Yeah. They incorporated the Lantern pod on the Tomcat. Yeah. So we cruised with what we call F-14B upgrades. It was actually a designation on the airplane. Okay. And so these airplanes had Lantern capability. So long story short, and for more, visit some episodes on the channel, they slapped the Lantern pod, which is the targeting part of the Lantern system that was designed for the Air Force, on the airplane. So all they had to figure out was, how do you make the Lantern pod talk to the AWG-9? And what they did is they put a little GPS antenna on the turtle back of the airplane. So in the back seat, where everything wound up happening, there was a hand control unit and a digital readout. So the navigation information I had was super accurate now. The INS didn't matter anymore, except if you had to shoot a Phoenix. And the Phoenix was actually going away at that time because Snort used Phoenix money to pay for Lantern. Yeah. But on my now, it's not the circular fishbowl anymore for my tactical information display that you see if you look at the cockpit of the rear cockpit of an F-14. Now I have what's called a PTID, programmable TID, that's a 10 by 10 display, high res. So suddenly, if you had a a high vis target that had cultural sensitivity, you're going to send the Tomcat. You're not going to send the Hornet. The Hornet had the lightning pod, and their thing was this little dinky, like looking at an old television. It was, fuzzy, and now we had gorgeous like thing, and the tables were turned because the Hornet guys copped max attitude back in the Bosnian conflict days. Like, okay, we're going to fight the war. You guys go do your photo missions, right? So it's like, okay, now we're going to go fight the war. You guys do your whatever you're going to do, because we're going to do all the important missions.